Norse-inspired epic fantasy is back, and I just finished the second book in the Bloodsworn saga by Gwynne, The Hunger of the Gods. So, what happens in this middle book, and why did it feel like middle book syndrome for me? So, hello, my name is Zach, and on this channel, I mostly review science fiction and fantasy books with a little of everything in between, such as comics, manga, personal development, and business. But today, yes, I am back in epic fantasy land with the Bloodsworn Saga Part 2, The Hunger of the Gods. So to me, this had a lot of the hallmarks that I struggled with in the first book, with both the pros and cons. So the first book, The Shadow of the Gods, it took me a while to get into the world of figuring out where I was to kind of ground myself in this Norse-inspired world that Gwynne had created. And after a little break between books, just waiting on the library holds to come through, I kind of felt that way here with the second book. And it wasn't that long ago, maybe a couple months since I read the first book. And already I feel like, not that I forgot where I was, but it took me a while to find my footing. And I found I was about 40% into the audiobook, which is coincidentally about the same time I got my footing in the first book, to figure out just where I was and kind of keep the names together and who was going on and what was going on where. Maybe it's because I don't read enough Norse, inspired fiction and maybe nonfiction too, to just keep up with everyone, the naming system and the way Gwynne uses Norse words in the prose. Not that it took me out of it, but just kind of made me just disconnected, I'd say, not out of the world, but maybe more immersed in the world, but also disconnected of where am I supposed to be in the world, who's doing what, who's going where. So in this book, the second book, it, as I mentioned, kind of really does to me follow that middle book syndrome, is that after the great ending of the first book, I really, once I got into the world and they go on that journey to the Battle of the Gods land where the final battle happened. That was just the coolest part. I just felt everything was so vivid as the bands are kind of walking through this wasteland and they're seeing the detritus of this battle between the gods, and everything just epic scale, and it's dirty, it's grim dark. It's just, I loved kind of the setting once I kind of got there with the first book. And in this book, it had a bit of the same, where I'm trying to keep the names straight of what's Varg doing, what's Orca doing, what are all these names happening. But at the same time, it does feel that world, and we're coming at the world in this second book after the events of the first world. So Lifa is back after she gets resurrected in the end of the first book. So her followers were following her. And again, that's just cool. I love this shape-shifting dragon god who's now walking among men. And so the world was very cool. I have to admit that I like the resurrections of the gods. This is, I guess, obviously spoilers, but the fact that the wolf god is Ulfir, I'm probably saying it wrong, but Ulfir, the wolf god, is back, and then they're using the same collaring but collaring kind of device that they forge to control the tainted that have the blood of the god, but they use it on an actual god. So they resurrect the wolf god, and the wolf god is there interacting with this band of warriors with the crew who have his blood in them to give wolf powers. So it's a really interesting dynamic that when the wolf god is among people with like his descendants basically, and he's talking as a god, and he's like, oh, my children, and the gods are kind of talking but interacting in the world. It's really interesting and really cool. I like these parts of it. These were some of the coolest parts, where we have this like interaction with the gods. I like kind of every scene with the gods in it, but what I didn't maybe like as much was like the non-god scenes, where it's a little bit of political intrigue that happens in this book, where kind of the armies are building, and we follow some of the other factions in this world and what's kind of going on with them, and how they're getting ready for what seems to be obviously the final battle in the third book. And this is where I guess my criticism comes in, is that it did have that middle book syndrome. Not to equate it to Lord of the Rings, but it felt a bit like the Two Towers, where yes, things happen and they don't fight Shelob the spider, but there is a final battle at the very end that wasn't super epic. It was, I guess, interesting, this final battle, but it wasn't like Dragon God Resurrection level like the first book. So it had an interesting kind of final ending scene climax, but it wasn't this epic scale climax of like a great final battle. So that's where I guess, yeah, I felt a lot like, again, Two Towers, where there was a battle and things happened and pieces moved on the chessboard, and we're kind of culminating and getting our way to the third book, the conclusion. We're going to have the Return of the King maybe in the third book of the Bloodsworn, where I'm sure these gods are going to fight. So we didn't really see the gods battle, and as some of the gods slowly get resurrected in this book, we kind of can see where the plot's going, that the gods are going to all maybe come back in some form or another, whether that's through this resurrection magic technology like magic, or they're just going to be resurrected by their followers. And then I assume there's got to be, I'm hoping, I mean, I assume there has to be some big epic battle with the tainted, that they're all going to fight, like all the wolf, descendants are going to fight the dragon descendants, and it's going to be some big epic battle, but also told in this grimdark, gritty Norse-inspired world style, and I'm very excited for that. And it didn't happen in this book, and that's where, if anything, it was my less expectations, because there was no Norse cool gritty epic scale like I got in the first book, that it kind of not petered out, but it just set up everything for the third book. So it's a good bridge book, and I'm sure the next book is going to be great. I hear so much great things about this series as a whole, and the third book just came out, so I'm excited to get to the third book in the Bloodsworn saga and just finish this saga. So I have place to hold already with the library. So hopefully, I think the wait is only about 4 or 5 weeks. As usual, the later books in the sagas tend to have shorter holds than everyone starting the first book, which I am totally guilty of. I start so many first book in series, so it shouldn't be too much longer before I get into the third and final book of the Bloodsworn saga. But this was my review, back on track of what we're talking about. The second book, the Hunger of the Gods. Again, middle book syndrome, some great pieces. It took me a while to get into things, because just resituating of who's going where, and there was a little bit maybe too much political things, but the characters are still cool. I love the character development and the world building with these gods amassing their armies and their factions and this resurrections and the magic. So I'm excited to see this all climax. So thanks for watching this review of John Gwynne's The Shadow of the Hunger of the Gods, not The Shadow, that's the first book, the Hunger of the Gods, book 2 of the Bloodsworn, and stick around for the next review, which eventually should come in hopefully a month or two for the third book. So thanks for watching, and be sure to check out other videos I have on the channel about science fiction and fantasy series. Have a great day.